the last joke I heard, oh, CARA, you went to the University of Alabama. I bet your entrance exam was, which hand has the rock in it? And I bet you got 2 chances to get it right. So, yes, and they're correct. I did get 2 chances, and I eventually got it right. But my husband is a Bible scholar. He's a resident Bible scholar. And a funny story about that was several years ago, I met a friend. I think it was Robin Kelly. She's not here to tell me that it was her. I met her for the first time, and she texted my friend Kathy and said, hey, I met your friend CARA. And so they started chatting about me over text. And Robin said, well, what does her husband do? And Kathy texted back some stuff, and then she said, he's a Bible scholar. Well, it auto-corrected, as texts sometimes do, that he's a bobsledder. And she's like, wait, a bobsledder in East Tennessee? So that's been our ongoing joke, that Earl is our resident bobsledder, and here he is. So AI made this slide for me. So they put Earl in a bobsledding suit and gave him the Holy Bible. And so he is the bobsledder in our family and in our community group. We have a lot of bobsledders in our community group. As many of you are bobsledders. So it's become a joke in women's Grace Women Bible studies that people say they are not bobsledders. So today we are in Esther. Here she is. I love Esther. Who doesn't love this book? It's awesome. It's a story. I love stories because I come from a long line of storytellers. My father, my grandfather, I love telling stories. It's got a heroine in Esther. It's got a villain in Haman. It's got a guide in Mordecai. And it's got a really bad king in King Ahasuerus. And it's known for several things. If you think of the book of Esther, what quote do you always think of? For such a time as this. And there's one more that Esther is famous for. If I perish, I perish. So Esther is known for those 2 quotes, and those are true. They're in there. And it's a story of a courageous woman who risked her life to save the Jewish people, but it's so much more than that. And we're going to dig deeper. We only have an hour. They only gave me an hour. I really need 3. So they gave me an hour to tell you all the things that we can pull out of Esther. The Bible is a book about God, and when we see God, we can trust Him more. And so we're going to see God in Esther. Esther is also famous for the fact that God is not even mentioned in this book. Neither is prayer or the temple or the sacrifices. It's not mentioned in the book of Esther. God is not mentioned, but His hand is all over the book. There's an unseen thread where God is working behind the scenes to show His glory. And He does that in our own life. If you write out your story and you step back, and I started writing out my story a couple years ago. I took this class, and you had to write out everything that ever happened to you. And, I'm 68 years old, so my story is long. And then you take a step back, and you look at your story, and you can see the unseen hand of God that used circumstances and people and events to weave His plan into your life. In Esther, we see that He is using people who have no idea that God is using them. So before we start, we need to get our historical bearings or where we are in the book of Esther. I know y'all have studied this, and Larry gave me the card that you have, and I made a little semi-timeline here. And I'm going to give you the Reader's Digest condensed version because I think you already know this. That in 1050, Israel was crying out for a king. They wanted a king, so God allowed Samuel, the last judge, to appoint King Saul to be king. He was not that great. David comes next. A lot of Israel prospered under David's leadership, and then Solomon, and then a civil war broke out. In 931, the kingdom was divided into the northern kingdom and the southern kingdom. The 10 tribes are in the northern kingdom, and the 2 tribes of Benjamin and Judah are in the southern kingdom. The northern tribe keeps the name Israel. The southern kingdom goes by Judah. That's their name now. The northern kingdom had no good kings, and so God allowed Assyria to capture them and scatter them. They're gone. in 722 BC. The southern kingdom fared a little bit better, and they lasted a total of 400 years, but because of their unrighteousness, God allowed Babylon to capture them, and they were conquered, and Babylon was also conquered Assyria. So now we had a single kingdom, and now they're in exile in Babylon. And then in 516 BC, the return, which you just studied, Ezra and Nehemiah, you just studied this, and Esther takes place right smack dab in the middle of the book of Esther. That's when all of this happened. So those are our historical bearings of what happened. Daniel had prophesied that the exile would be 70 years, and he was correct. So no stoning of him. So when you studied Ezra and Nehemiah, it shows God's activity in the lives of the people who returned to Israel, and Esther shows the activity of the lives of those who stayed. So it was during the time of exile in Babylon that the people from Judah, the Israelites from Judah, became known as the Jews. So, you had the Hebrews and the Israelites, and now they're called the Jews because they were from Judah and they were in exile. Life had been different from the life they had known in Israel before they were exiled. There was a before and there was an after. When they were in Babylon, there was no temple, there was no structure to their religion, and they were there alone. And I'm sure they questioned God. Are you still there, God? Are you still keeping the promise that you made, to the covenant that you made with us? The Jews had experienced a before and an after. Before the exile, there were signs that God was still there, keeping his promise as his covenant with Israel. And after being exiled, from everything they knew, God was still there. There's a before and an after in your lives, lots of them. Matt was just talking about that this week. Before we hit the wall, if you were there this Sunday, he was talking about running into the wall, the before, when life was good, and then the after, when you got the diagnosis, when there was the divorce, when your adult children deconstructed their faith and they are now your prodigal children. I hear that all the time. There was a before and there is an after in your life and in my life. But when we look at the hand of God, we see that he was faithfully working behind the scenes. And Matt said that Sunday. I told him after church, you said like 3 or 4 things I was going to say in Esther. God was working behind the scenes. All right, so now we're going to move on into chapter 1. You have an outline, and you're thinking, how in the world are we going to get through this outline? But we will. We may be rushing at the end, but we will. So let's look at Esther chapter 1. You should have an outline that you can follow along. Remember that Esther is a story that we can pull out many biblical truths, and our main character in this is King Ahasuerus. It's a hard name to say. Some may say Xerxes in your translation. Sometimes I just call him King A. Here's the verse we're going to read in Esther 1 and 2. Now that in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days the king Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel. That's Esther 1 and 2. So he ruled, so he's king. He ruled over this huge, vast empire, and here is a map. It's a huge area. That was I put a little star on Susa, where the capital was, where King Ahasuerus was sitting on his royal throne. And so in chapter 1, we get a good taste of what happens in the world's first superpower. And we will read that here in Esther 1, 3 through 4. In the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and all his servants. The army of Persia and Media and the nobles and the governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and the pomp of his greatness for many days. 180 days. A 6-month-long party he threw. Dinner parties were a big deal in ancient Persia, and the king spared no expense. His guest list was the who's who of the Persian Empire, and they were all there. And verse 4 is very telling, where it says, he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and the pomp of his greatness. the king Ahasuerus was all about himself. He was a very proud man, and he wanted everyone to know everything he had. So when that party ended after 6 months, he threw another party in Susa and invited the rich and the poor and everyone who wanted to come. And there they are, party animals. Look at them. But it was so lavish. They had blue and white cotton curtains, linen cords, purple and silver rods, marble pillars, gold couches, mosaic pavement, mother of pearl, and other precious stones. You know, have you ever been invited to a wedding, and when you get to the reception, you say maybe to someone like, how much did this cost? This must have cost them a fortune. We went to a wedding last year that I think the flowers at the reception cost more than our house. I really believe that. And it was this kind of party. It was more lavish. This was more lavish. You know, when we got married, and I bet you did too, at your wedding, you had mints and nuts. Anybody? Yes. That's what we had at our wedding. This was not a wedding, but it was a lavish, lavish party, so it was over the top. The king was displaying his greatness. It was all about him. Now, Queen Vashti was having her own party of her own, and after partying, the king was probably wasted. My mother used to say he was 3 sheets to the wind. I don't know exactly what that means, but that's what she called people who had been drinking a lot. King Ahasuerus had a little bit too much to drink, and he commanded the eunuchs to bring in his wife, his beautiful Vashti. He said, put your crown on and get in here. And she refused. We don't know why. The Bible doesn't tell us why she refused, but I can speculate that she refused because she didn't want to be paraded around in front of a bunch of drunk men. She just didn't want that. So she said no, and the king was furious. The most powerful man in the world couldn't get his wife to do what he said. And so we see over and over that he was a pretty weak leader. So he calls in his groupies and his flunkies and his yes men and says, and they knew what happened, and they said something absolutely ridiculous. They said, not only did Vashti wrong you, she wronged all men. So now our wives will say to us, we don't have to do what you say because the queen doesn't have to do what the king says. They came to a very illogical conclusion. So their advice was also ridiculous, and they said, just get rid of her and replace her with someone more suitable for you. So the king had a proclamation through his entire kingdom, and we saw the map, his entire kingdom of 127 provinces, that women must honor their husbands and men would be the master over them. It was a proclamation. They had to do this. Absolutely not a great idea. Because we're not talking about godly men here. We're not talking about godly men who honor and cherish and love their wives, as the Bible tells us that men love their wives like Christ loves the church. We're talking about men who say, you must obey every single thing I say. It was more like slavery. And so that was the end of Vashti, and she's never to be heard from again. I'm going to look her up when I get to heaven. Okay, so then we're slowly making our way through. I'm keeping a good watch on the time, and we're going to be able to do this. So in chapter 2, we finally meet Esther, but first we have to meet Mordecai. The king calmed down. He may have regretted getting rid of Vashti, but because he had been drinking a lot, but he was a weak leader. He was constantly giving away his power. He gave it away. He had his yes men. He was easily persuaded to do things. And history tells us that he loses a war with Greece, and that's a different story. But his pride destroyed him. So he was on the search for a new queen, and the virgins all over the vast empire traveled to be interviewed to be queen. And they came under the harem, the care of the harem, led by a eunuch named Haggai. And a eunuch was a man that was chosen by the king to be castrated so he could be trusted around women. You know, Esther's a heavy book. It's more than for such a time as this, and I perish, and a beautiful Jewish woman saving her people. It's about a lot of heaviness of mistreatment of women and mistreatment of men and mistreatment of power and a lot of bloodshed. So who was Mordecai? In verse 2, in chapter 2, verses 5 and 6, now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, son of Shimei, son of Kish, a Benjaminite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives. So that's important because we find out from there that Mordecai was a descendant of Kish, and Kish was the father of King Saul. So what that tells us is that Mordecai had deep, deep religious roots. So in verse 7, we finally meet Esther. Her Hebrew name was Hadassah, and Mordecai was her uncle. She was Mordecai's cousin. She was Mordecai's cousin, the daughter of his uncle. She was orphaned. She was beautiful. It says she had a wonderful figure. And Mordecai raised her as a daughter. He raised her as one of his own. And she fits the bill with Haggai the eunuch. Haggai, she comes to the palace, goes to the harem. Haggai really liked her, and so he hits the golden buzzer and sends her straight to Hollywood. He really liked her. If you watch The Voice, you will get that reference. So she got the best place in the harem. And I always thought that was like an oxymoron. I mean, what is the best place in a harem anyway? But she was there, and Mordecai said, "Don't tell anyone that you're a Jew," and she did that. So here she is. Well, anyway, so after a year in Persia, she was at the Persian spa. She got all the treatments. She got the ointments, the retinols, the microdermabrasion, the microneedling, the peptides, the acids, all of that she had done for a whole year. The Botox, she probably had the Botox, the night creams, the day creams. And so it was time for her debutante party, not to come out to society, but to come out to the king. And he was enthralled. He was enthralled. And so he crowned Esther the queen. She was chosen. And why is this important? We see that even in small places, God is at work. He uses people from small towns, large cities, remote villages, broken homes, broken and vulnerable people, hurt people to help bring about his plan. And in your story, you can see that. How has he used you to accomplish his plan? It was already said, I grew up in a small town in Alabama. There's the map of Alabama, and I put a star right there on my little town. I think about 900, maybe 1,000 people. Aliceville, Alabama. If you've ever been there, gold star to you. If you've ever heard of it, gold star to you. Aliceville was named after a woman, Alice, who fell in a well and died there. So they named the town after her. I know a lot of great heritage there. So I grew up there. We used to have a red light, and they changed it, but people kept running it. So they changed it to a 4-way stop. So like that would help. We had a Piggly Wiggly. We had a Baptist church, a Methodist church, a Presbyterian church, and then out in the county, way out in the county, we had some Pentecostals and some Church of God churches out in the middle of the county. And our town was so small, and this is the truth, our town was so small that the doctor who delivered me and my siblings was also my Spanish teacher in high school. Yes. True story. Yes. Dr. Gentry, Buenos Dias. Yes. My neighbor were catfish farmers. They grew catfish next door to us. My high school graduating class had 30 people, and so it was pretty easy to graduate in the top 10. And so I often wondered, what would my life be like if I stayed? It was a great place to grow up. It really was. But what would my life be like if I stayed? When I was 16, my parents called me a religious teenager. When I was 16, my church, First Baptist Church of Aliceville, I heard a missionary speak, Miss Addie Collins. Now, I'd heard about Miss Addie my entire life. Miss Addie had gone to China when she was, young girl, never married. She was in China, saw very little fruit, and she came home in her mid-80s back to Aliceville First Baptist Church so the people there could care for her in her old age. So I heard her speak, and lots of times I cry when I think about Miss Addie because my heart was captured from missions. My heart was captured for the world. My heart was captured for the Great Commission. And so I went home and I told my parents I was going to be a missionary. And they thought good, honey, good. They thought it was just a phase. And so here, 45 years later, I'm still in that missionary phase. God plucked me out of this small town and gave me a platform for ministry. In my ministry with Crew and my ministry here at church and my ministry, the places I've been able to go around the world. So he was working behind the scenes in my life. I had no idea of all of those things that happened to me as a child. I grew up with a sister with a severe mental illness that we had to keep under wraps. So all of the things that happened to me growing up, God was using behind the scenes, and he's using things behind the scenes in your life right now. You don't know that God is working. His hand is threading in your life his plan to fulfill his will for you. God, the same God who had Esther, the orphaned, adopted, unknown Jew, chosen as queen of the largest empire of the world, God plucked her out of Susa and made her that. Okay, so God's still working. Esther becomes queen. We already put up that slide that she became queen. And Mordecai's outside the gate. He's outside the gate worried about her. And he's out there all the time. And he overheard, there he is, he overheard these two eunuchs talking about how they're going to overthrow the king. And so he was in the right place at the right time. And God protected his plan with the Jewish people because Mordecai had this plan thwarted. And now we meet the villain, Haman. Even though Mordecai stopped the plot, Haman was promoted in the king's court. He was promoted. Mordecai was overlooked or forgotten. So who was Haman? It's important to know who he was. He was an Agagite, the descendant of King Agag, ruler of the Amalekites. That sounds fun. God told King Saul to attack and kill all the Amalekites, and King Saul disobeyed, and he didn't do it. So that's why Haman's still standing around, because he is one of the descendants. So Mordecai and Haman represent a rivalry and a hatred between Israel and her worst enemies. Mordecai refused to acknowledge Haman's position. He refused to bow down to Haman, not because of religious reasons, but because there was no respect there. They were rivals. And Mordecai was outed as a Jew. And Haman came up with this plan to destroy all Jews because Mordecai would not bow down to him. Destroy all the Jews, not there in Susa, just there in Susa, but all the Jews in all 127 provinces. Total genocide. So he got so mad when Mordecai did not even stand up when he walked by, much less bow down to him. So here's a verse in Esther 3, 9, and 11. Then Haman said to King Ahasuerus, "There's a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom." That was true. He didn't say they were the Jewish people. He just said there's people scattered around. Their laws are different from those of every other people, half-truth, and they do not keep the king's laws. There's nothing that says they didn't keep the laws of the kingdom when they lived there. So blatant lie of Haman to get what he wants. "If it pleases the king, let it be decreed that they be destroyed, and I will pay 10,000 talents of silver into the hands of those who have charge of the king's business, and they may put into the king's treasurer." And so the king took off his signet ring from his hand, gave it to Haman, the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, the enemy of the Jews. And the king said to Haman, "The money is given to you. The people also do with it as you see." So he put his stamp of approval, but he didn't know the whole story. Again, he was a weak leader. He didn't stop to find out exactly who Haman was talking about. So in Esther, we learn of their plans. They decided to cast lots, throw the dice. Let's roll the dice, the pur, to see. There were little clay dice-like things. They would roll the dice to make decisions. They cast them, and a decree was written on the 13th day. I have this on a slide. The pur was thrown in the first month of Nisan, which is March or April for our calendar. And so they rolled the dice that day, and so the decree was to be written to destroy the Jews on the 13th of that month. So they rolled the dice again to see when the annihilation was going to take place, and that was 11 months later on the 13th of Adar, which is February or March. And for the Jewish people at that time, the 13th day of the first month was the day before Passover. Read about that in Leviticus 23. So the edict was written the day before they started the celebration of the Passover. And I love this proverb: we may throw the dice, but the Lord determines how they fall. So how many times in our own lives do things seem left to chance? All the time. But God is accomplishing his plan. He's in control, usually behind the scenes. So imagine that you were there. Imagine the scene that you were there. You were one of the Jewish people living in Persia. You didn't go back to Jerusalem. You're still living in Persia because of the exile 70 years ago. And you hear word that the king is going to destroy you, your family, your people, the entire people group. And so what do you think? Are you trusting that God, and you find this out the day before the Passover, the day before you celebrate being delivered from slavery out of Egypt. Well, God delivered us for this. So what do you think? Are you trusting God's promises that God will prevail in these crazy, seemingly irreversible circumstances? Or do you assume he's just given up on you because you're so far from where you used to be? And that's the question we all answer when we find ourselves in circumstances that seem irreversible. I've heard so many people say, I just don't have any hope in this situation. I have no hope that my child is going to come back to Jesus. I have no hope that my marriage is going to work. I have no hope that I'm going to get past this sickness or this chronic pain. So people ask that question. Even though God is never mentioned in the Bible, in the book of Esther, yes, in the Bible, but in the book of Esther, at the end, we can add, got misplaced in my PowerPoint here, so it threw me off. There's moments that he shows up where you can say, only God did that. And that's happened over and over in my life. We can't always understand what God's doing, why he's doing it, why he's not answering, when will he come through for me like he's promised to do. Even though God is never mentioned in the book of Esther, at the end you can add up all the moments where he showed up and you can say, only God did this. So we finally made it to chapter 4. We're going to fly through this. The annihilation of the Jews. Oh, there's a new tone. All of a sudden there's a new tone. We've been celebrating that Esther was picked. She's crowned queen. Yay, everything is great. And then there's a new tone. The annihilation of the Jews has been decreed. And Mordecai goes in the morning and he's crying and he's bawling his eyes out. And he goes to the court and outside the courtyard and he's crying. And he puts on sackcloth and ashes. There's mourning everywhere, all over the province. He's weeping, he's fasting, he's lamenting. And Esther was in the good place in the harem, and so she didn't know what was happening. So she sent clothes to Mordecai because she had heard that he was mourning. And she said, Hathach, the eunuch, Hathach, it's a crazy name. Hathach was the messenger. So she sent Hathach some clothes to give to Mordecai. Mordecai refused them. And so she sent Hathach back and says, what is happening? What is wrong? And Mordecai sends Hathach back to Esther with a copy of the decree. He said, hey, they're getting ready to wipe us out. You must go before the king. And so she sends Hathach back. This is like first century texting. Hathach was the message carrier. She sends Hathach back and she said, I'll die if I approach the king. Because he has to call me in. He has to summon me. And he hasn't summoned me in 30 days. So she hasn't seen the king in 30 days. And if she goes before the king without being summoned and he doesn't put his scepter out, then she is killed. And so she says, I'll die. And Mordecai sends Hathach back again and says, well, you're going to die anyway because you are a Jewish woman and your people are going to die. Everyone is going to die. And then the famous words, maybe you're in this position, Esther, for such a time as this. Hathach, carrying that message, had no idea that he was going to be famous for carrying that line. He's a nobody. He's a eunuch. And he carried that famous line back to Esther. And Esther sends Hathach back yet again. He got his steps in that day. And he said, told Mordecai, gather the Jews, fast, and I will do the same. So that's what happens in chapter 5. In chapter 4 and chapter 5 So they were fasting, and they were probably praying. It doesn't say they were praying, and they were probably praying that the king would summon Esther in. Please, God, let the king summon Esther in so she doesn't have to risk her life. And the answer to that was no, he did not summon her in. So they were probably praying, let the king present his scepter so Esther does not have to die. And that's what happened. He did, and God's hand is all over this. So after fasting on the third day, this is my favorite part of the whole book. This is it. Esther, I kind of get teary-eyed over this too. Esther put on her royal robes. What does that mean? She put on her royal robes. She's claiming who she is. She's claiming her true identity. She's the queen, she's chosen by the king, and she's royal. So you can tell just the difference in her countenance. She puts on those royal robes, and she's going to approach the king. Esther is called Queen Esther 14 times in this book, and 13 of them are after chapter 5, verse 1. It's like she was queen, but she didn't have her true identity, and then she put on her royal robes, and she identified with who she is. So that's who we are when we put on our royal robes. The queen's royal robes were her identity as queen, chosen by the king. I already said all this. But what is our position in Christ when we put on our royal robes? We have royal robes. We need to put those royal robes on every day. And when we do, this is who we are. We're adopted, beloved, chosen, delighted in, established, forgiven. We're heirs. We're invited. We're justified. We're unashamed. We're victorious. We're known. We're loved. We're a masterpiece. We're not condemned. We're purified, qualified, redeemed, sustained, treasured, welcome, and exquisitely made. And much, much more. So when Esther approached the king, he put his scepter out, and she said, What is your request? And she said, I want you and Haman to come to a feast. So king grabs Haman, and they go to a feast. You know, we were expecting Esther to say, I am a Jew, and you have declared annihilation of all of my people. Please take this decree back. But she didn't. So they had a feast. And while they were eating and drinking, the king says, well, what is your request? And she said, I want you to come back again for another feast. Now, Haman was getting really big head. You know, he was getting really proud because the queen invited only him and the king to a feast. He was really happy, and he was really prideful, and he left there, and he ran into Mordecai. And Mordecai didn't even stand up or acknowledge him. It made him furious. He went home. He told his wife, I got to have a feast with the queen and the king, only me, because I'm important. But I saw that Mordecai, I can't stand him. I hate him. And so his wife gave him some really strange advice. She said, well, just kill him. Just go hang him. And so he had the gallows built. The king can't sleep that night after the first banquet. You know, I have sleepless nights, and I wonder, you know, what, God, do you have something to say to me? And sometimes he does, or sometimes it's because I just had too much caffeine that day. But King Ahasuerus, God had something to say to him. And so the king asked for the royal books to be brought before him. Now, I guess he wanted to look at Facebook to see what he had missed that day. What have I missed? Let me see what happened. And so I want to read that to you. I had it on the Bible. Of course, my Bible went to sleep. And now I have to open it up again. If you have your Bible, you can look at it. It's Esther 6, chapters 1 through 11, because I want to read it because there's a hinge verse where the whole book hinges, and it's verse 10. So on that night, the king could not sleep. There he is, laying there wide awake. And he gave orders to bring the book of memorable deeds, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king, and it was found written how Mordecai had told about Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold and who had sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And the king says, well, what honor or distinction has been bestowed on Mordecai for this? And the king's young men who attended him said, nothing has been done for Mordecai. And then he heard noise in the court, and the king said, who is in the court? Now Haman had just entered the court. This is kind of funny. The Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to speak to the king about having Mordecai hanged on the gallows that Haman had prepared for him. The king's young men told him, Haman is here standing in the court, and the king said, well, let him come in. So Haman came in, and the king said this to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman, because he was so prideful, said to himself, well, whom would the king delight to honor more than me? And Haman said to the king, he had some great ideas here. For the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought, which the king has worn, and the horse that he has ridden on and the crown that has been on his head. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials, and let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on a horse through the city of the square, proclaiming, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. Here's the hint verse of the whole book. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse, just like you said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew. Can you imagine what Haman thought? Leave nothing out, do everything you have mentioned. So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai, and he led him through the city square, proclaiming before him. He probably didn't do it very enthusiastically. Thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. And here's poor Mordecai, so downtrodden, leading Mordecai through the Haman. He was downtrodden, leading Mordecai. So right now we know that Esther's a Jew, and the decree was written to destroy the Jews, but the king did not know this, that she was Jewish, or the decree was written to annihilate the whole flock of them. He, again, was uninformed. So verse 10, a turning point, is a great reversal in the story. So many great reversals. The bad guys are winning. The good guys are being overlooked. And Mordecai didn't get paraded around the city dressed in his royal things because he was a good guy. He got paraded around the city in the royal finery because God chose to deliver him and his covenant promise to Israel. You know, his mercy to us is not because we are good or we make good moral choices. His mercy and grace to us is because of his righteousness. All right. Oh, so Esther goes back to the queen, to the king, and says, hey, can you take this decree away? And he can't, because in Persia, once it's been sealed, it's been sealed. The king gives Esther the house of Haman, and Mordecai goes before the king, and there's very few that went before the king, and he gives Mordecai his ring that he had taken for Haman. Esther gives Haman his house to Mordecai. Esther goes before the king again, and she weeps, and she begs, and she pleads, please stop this, the annihilation of my people. And so the king learned that Esther, his wife, was Jewish. So he said, I can't, but you can write a decree. So they did, and the new decree was, on the day that comes when it's time for the annihilation, you guys can fight back. So that was the new edict. So there was a lot of rejoicing going on because now they're no longer sitting ducks, and Mordecai was promoted in second command. Okay, we've seen lots of reversals in this book. In chapter 7, oh, that was chapter 7, sorry. Okay, now the second banquet. Now the hammer is going to fall. So the king and Haman went to feast with Queen Esther, and on the second day, as they were drinking wine and feasting, the king said to Esther, what's your wish, Queen Esther? I will be granted to you whatever you want, even half of my kingdom. And the queen said, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and she did, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted for my wish and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed and killed and to be annihilated. If we had merely been sold as slaves, as men and women, I would be silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss to the king. Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther, well, who is he? Where is he? Who did this? Poor Haman. And she said, a foe and an enemy, the wicked Haman. And here he sits right there. Then Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. So the king runs out of the room. He's furious. I got a little ahead of myself. He was furious. And he comes back, and he's like, right when he walks in, Haman throws himself, begging for his life on the queen. And he said, you're assaulting my wife right in front of me? It's over. So they go and they hang him. And he's mad at himself too. And so he gets out of it by hanging Mordecai on the gallows. So I got a little ahead of myself in the story. All of the estate was given to Esther. They gave it over to Mordecai. Mordecai is in a high position. And then the decree that you can defend yourself on the day that you're going to get attacked, you can defend yourself. I love this quote by Kelly Mentor. The king can't rescind Haman's decree, just like God can't undo the sin that entered the world, and we can't undo the evil in our world. He allows a life-saving decree to save the Jewish people, just as God sent his son to fix the consequences for our sin. The gospel of Jesus is the counter decree to the ultimate consequence of our sin. I love that. So the day is there. This is a hard chapter to read because there's lots of bloodshed. It's gory. It's hard to read. Sometimes it's hard to understand why God allows such violence, especially when there's women or children involved. But it's not the fact that God doesn't love violence. It's that he hates sin. So blood was shed that day. Now in the 12th month, which is in the month of Adar, on the 13th day of the same, when the king's command and edict were about to be carried out, on that very day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain mastery over them, the reverse occurred, and the Jews gained mastery over those who hated them. What a turn of events. That day in Susa, the Jews killed 500 people, including Haman's 10 sons, and they're all named in the book of Esther. There was a lot of plunder to be taken, but they didn't touch it. The fact that there was plunder to take was mentioned 3 times, and they didn't take it. Esther asked the king for one more day of killing. I always had a hard time with that. Doesn't sit well with me. She wanted to kill for one more day. Come on, Esther. It's like overkill. No pun intended. So more were killed. 75,000 were killed throughout the whole province. There was a lot of bloodshed. The command God made to Saul to wipe out the Amalekites was finally fulfilled. When all this was over, Mordecai declared a day of celebration, a day of victory, because the pur that had been cast to pick the day of elimination was a day that God used to use a grand reversal, and they called that celebration Purim. And the Jews today celebrate it happily. We're going to do this study in the Grace Women's Bible Study. If you want to come, you want to get into more detail, we're going to do Esther in our study starting in September, and we're going to have the Purim feast on our last day. So if anyone you want to come and celebrate with us, that would be great. Was that my time? My time's up? Okay. So they celebrated outside of Susa. It's celebrated on the 13th of Adar, and those living in Susa celebrated on the 15th. Holy war is not about taking advantage or extinguishing evil. It's about, and I'm grateful that we don't have holy war now. It's about extinguishing evil. It's not about taking advantage of. So all the Jewish people in all the provinces were notified of this big celebration. Everyone celebrate the day that we were delivered because of Esther's risk that she took on behalf of her people. So for me, I love this quote by Karen Jobes also. From the beginning of time, God's war has been against sin and evil. We seem to want God to destroy sin and evil, but leave people alone. However, sin and evil do not exist apart from beings who sin and beings who do evil. And here's a slide of the Purim celebration. So Mordecai was second in command now. He was a big deal in Persia. He was a big man on campus, and which is a foreshadowing of Jesus taking over and being the person whose blood was shed for us. So my takeaways from Esther, my big takeaways from this book, is that God fulfills his promises through ordinary people in everyday life. He works this way much more often than he does doing miracles. God is working out his purpose in every detail of your life and in my life. Nothing is wasted. No circumstance can seem meaningless. He's working behind the scenes, and he's moving when we aren't even aware that right now God is moving behind the scenes to accomplish his will. And when we look backwards on our lives, we see the hand of God in all our circumstances, all our pain, all the things that we have gone through, and even in our greatest moments. You know, even though we don't celebrate this Purim holiday, we have so many things in our life where we can celebrate that are worthy of divine reversals in our own life, which is the death of Jesus, which completely reversed the trajectory of our lives. So that brings us to the end of our history books, correct? And so my dear friend Sherry Watford's going to come. Is she here? I haven't seen her. Are you here? Oh, hey, Sherry. She's going to come now, right? Yes? Okay. She's going to come and talk to us about the 400 years of silence that happened after the historical books.
Can you hear me? Yes. CARA. Y'all give CARA a round of applause. So I told her not to make me look too bad because I'm not a speaker like CARA, but doesn't she? I love CARA, and I love her teaching, and it's always so clear, and so it comes from the heart. So I just really appreciate that about her. I told Larry that I just really wanted to share a little bit about these 400 silent years because we were looking at about 83 years before that happened with Queen Esther. So I'm just going to share a little bit. My name is Sherry Watford, and I've been at Grace for about 14 years. I'm married to a man from Alabama, Roll Tide, that loves the Crimson Tide. But he loves Jesus more, and he loves me very much. I know that because he's still with me. And he's heard what I've been trying to put together for a short little quip probably 10 times, and he's been very patient with me. So I'm just going to start there. So I considered, when I first started walking with the Lord about 35 years, I thought about those 400 years. They were silent. Did people quit talking? Was God quit? You know, I didn't know anything about it. And I kind of wanted to study it, and I looked at it a little bit, but I just needed to learn the Bible, and I needed to learn about God. So I kind of just left it there. But it wasn't until back when Matt started here, it was maybe the first or second year that he was here, he did the Christmas sermon on the fullness of time. And he talked about how God had used the Roman road. He had used the fact that there was one language and one currency. And all of those things had come together to bring in the gospel and bring in the Savior of the world. And it just kind of piqued my attention, and I started looking at it then. So, but the whole point was that those silent years had been used to usher in the Savior, and we were celebrating that. So for me, it was an aha moment, a reminder not to underestimate our God. For me, it was a reminder that just because I don't know what he's doing or it seems to be silent, he is always working behind the scenes. And I thought about how much this really did go with Esther, the same thing. He's still working behind the scenes in the best of times and the worst of times, in our lives and in the world. And he's working all things together for good for those who love the Lord and are called according to his purposes. Romans 8:28 was like that for me the first time I heard it. Oh my goodness. He was going to take all my messes and mistakes from my younger years and work them together for good. Could that be true? Could he really do that? And the biggest question was, why would he do that with my rebellion and my disobedience? I've since learned the answer to that question because it is who he is. He loves his children, every one of us, and his heart is to rescue, redeem, and transform every one of us into the image of his Son. It truly is his amazing grace. I've never been a history buff, but studying these years has called me down paths of curiosity, and I found myself intrigued by these not so silent years in terms of what he was doing in the world in those days. I will share some of those things in this little block of time, but I share with the hope it will pique your curiosity as well about not just these years, but this amazing book that we're studying, that he has given us, protected, and speaks personally to us each time we sit down and commune with him. So at the end of Malachi, we find the Persian Empire, which was also mentioned in place, and the Jewish people able to worship, rebuild with relative peace and contentment. But trouble is brewing as we meet a young warrior by the name of Alexander the Great, the son of King Philip, well educated in Greek philosophy, culture, and politics. He studied from the age of 13 to 16 by none other than Aristotle, who may have been known today as an influencer of culture, politics, ethics, and physical science. He certainly influenced a young Alexander as he proceeded to take over the world and spread his Greek culture in every area he conquered. Even though the humanistic and ungodly Greek culture dominated during this time, the Jews were still allowed religious freedom. Things were short-lived for Alexander, though, as he died in early death. I find it very interesting, of 33 years, just like our Savior. You know, in my mind, I wonder, did he think he was being called as the Savior? He was trying to take over the world, and our Savior didn't he? So he was 33 years old, believing and some believe that he had been poisoned. His death led to Judea and surrounding regions being ruled by the Hellenistic, and I didn't get this quite right, but Seleucid Empire. Does somebody know how to pronounce that? Seleucid. Thank you. Seleucid. I need Seleucid Empire. I'm going to have to say it again. They launched a massive campaign of repression against the Jewish religion. They outlawed Jewish religious rites, desecrated the temple, and made it a place to worship their Greek gods, and were trying to force the Jews to adopt this Greek culture. They burned some of the scrolls and scriptures which set off a firestorm in the world, which led to the Maccabean revolt against the Greeks in 164 BC. I'm saying this is just a lot of quick stuff, so I know there's a lot more going on, but this was just things that I found. The Jews retook Jerusalem, reclaimed the temple, which they cleansed and rededicated to Yahweh. 63 years later, Pompey takes over Israel by Roman rule. Much of what happened in this time period can be found in the book of Daniel's chapter 2, 7, 8, and 11. It sounds to me like it might be a good time for the Jews to begin crying out to God, and perhaps they did, because the stage is now set for the Christmas story to begin. Just a few important things that took place during these 400 years. The Hebrew Bible was translated into the Greek Septuagint. The Hebrew language gave way to the Aramaic and predominant Greek language, reminiscent of Genesis 11:1, when the whole world had one language. Synagogues got their beginnings as a central place of worship and introduction for the Jew and an instruction for the Jews. It was the first religious persecutions took place under this empire. The Apocrypha was written in that time period, which is a talk for another day. The Jews began separating into different groups according to their interpretation of the Jewish law. We now know them as the Sadducees and Pharisees, and there were also the scribes, and a little-known group I found very interesting called the Essenes. They seem to have faded into the gray, as they're not mentioned in the New Testament. I couldn't help exploring who they were. It says they had a strict adherence to Jewish law, focused on purity and communal living. They seemed to have more affection for one another than the other groups, and I found that very interesting. They would not offer sacrifices. They were against the practice of slavery, believing all people were created equal. Some believe that John the Baptist may have had some affiliation with this group of Jews. especially when you hear that they believe themselves to be a voice crying out in the wilderness. Some believe they were converted, and some of the first Christians some believe that they were converted and became some of the first Christians, following John and later Jesus. Interesting, but entirely possible, as the first Christians were both converted Jews and Gentile believers. In closing, I want to give you something to ponder. So, the time of God's chosen people being in slavery in Egypt in the 400 silent years represent like time periods, something we find quite often in the Bible. As I Googled around that, I found some interesting theories. The 400 years in captivity kept God's people together because we humans tend to wander when we get the chance. They begin to cry out in Exodus 2:23. It says they moaned in their slavery. In Exodus 3:7, God heard and was concerned. Some would suggest that God not only kept them together, but wanted them to reproduce and multiply for the Exodus. That he had planned long before they knew what was going on. He wanted them large enough in numbers that they would not become extinct as a people group in the wilderness wanderings. They would not become extinct as a people group in the wilderness wanderings. After all, he was preparing for a Messiah that would come out of that group of chosen, imperfect people. The 400 silent years, we find the Jews coming back again from captivity, beginning to rebuild. The fact that they begin to separate instead of unify sounds a little like the Methodists, the Baptists, the Independents, Charismatics of our day, according to their own interpretation of the law and the traditions. They find it harder and harder to remain distinctive, being constantly pulled, prodded, and forced into Greek culture. Were they getting weary? Did they begin to cry out to Yahweh? The fullness of time was knocking at their door, and God was hearing their prayers. I heard this song as I was exploring this, and it struck me of how true it seemed, that it seemed to describe what happened. Starry, starry night. They did not listen. They did not know how. Perhaps they'll listen now. I encourage you to do some of your own exploring about these 400 years. Just as CARA said, and I found through all of this, is that our God is always working. He's working in our life, and he's working in our world, even when we don't see him. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherry. Just before Dan comes up, thank you, Sherry and CARA. This was just a great session that we